You had just tweeted about, I think yesterday, about how European high theory, left-wing European high theory, will overlap with the domestic U.S. libertarian right.
Right. So So there was this New York Times piece by Christopher Caldwell, right, who's a conservative journalist, in which he kind of gave a favorable write-up to Giorgio Agamben's COVID writings, right, which have kind of been super controversial. And Giorgio Agamben is like a sort of, high theory, working in the line of somebody like Foucault, and very, very much like continuing the project of Foucault, basically. And so I just thought it was intriguing that, like, and I think the only other person I've seen in the U.S. who, like, gave some positive coverage to Agamben's, because Agamben's take was pretty much that, it's consistent with stuff he was writing about the war on terror like 15 years ago, right? Where he like refused to visit the U.S. because he wouldn't be fingerprinted, because he thought the rise of like biometric surveillance was like such a disturbing trend. So similarly, like his take on COVID is that it provides for this abrupt expansion of the range of state power, and based on this kind of this complex and in some ways dubious pretext. I mean, that's his claim, right? So obviously he was kind of pilloried by a lot of people for saying that, and then the only people who I've seen kind of give him any favorable coverage are like on the right in the U.S., which is interesting because he's like very much, he's like postmodern, whatever, postmodern neo-Marxism or whatever whatever people call it. I mean, he would clearly not that that's an accurate description of him, but usually from a sort of right-wing perspective, and
he's a lefty academic type, right?
That's like, I mean, if you go back 15 years to like, and that's like around when I was going to grad school. There was tons of stuff about his writings about the war on terror and like the concept of the state of exception. So the slant of like how his critique of the state was interpreted was very much like, using his theory to think about like the Patriot Act and like what the Bush administration was, the huge expansion of state power that took place post 9/11 under the Bush administration. So he's kind of using the same arguments to think about what's happening on COVID.
That feels like an eternity ago now, that, and I've seen, I don't want to attribute something that falsely, but I feel like sort of old school liberalism, or, in his case, probably he'd say I'm a leftist, but old school leftism, old school liberalism, it's all being sort of upended now because, Trump era politics, it's disputed how much of this is really triggered by Trump, like this sort of like, throwing away of free speech ideals, dissing liberalism in total, that kind of thing really comes from Trump, or it really predates Trump and will outlast him, right? I don't know, but Chomskyite, new atheism, it even I feel like new atheists now have always been right wing. It's like I always feel like, of course they've been on the right, That's not how it was, though. That's not how it looked in 2005. And a lot of that 2005 era leftist liberalism has just now been, it seems to have flipped sides due to things happening external to itself. And that's.
Yeah, and I mean, I think so. I guess the point I was making about the sort of larger theory. I mean, you definitely read, if you read Foucault's account of like biopolitics, in some ways, like I've always thought there was sort of a strong kind of libertarian strain to it, which I think plays somewhat differently in Europe in that you have this, the sort of, I think because of the way American politics have played out with this kind of right-wing anti-statism, at least in theory, being the sort of dominant worldview, sort of since the Reagan era, like the sort of criticism of big government and so on.
Yeah, that's
You
the
know,
only conservatism I've known my whole life.
yeah.
That's the only kind I've known. I was born in '78,
Mhm.
and so that's just I've not known anything else. And
Right.
it seems like, sorry, go ahead.
But whereas in Europe you do have like sort of statist conservatism, right? And sort of that's a very like the sort of centralized, bureaucratized, and sort of expertise driven sort of management of the state, is not, it doesn't have this quite the same, in the US, there's kind of a history of that being associated with like liberalism, basically,
Yeah.
starting with probably like, the progressive, Woodrow Wilson, and especially after, the New Deal. But I think it plays somewhat differently, as I understand it, in European politics. And, when you read somebody like Foucault and his critiques of sort of state power over, biopolitics, right, where the body becomes like the site of sort of the exercise of state power, you can see how then.
So that term biopolitics, thanks for explaining. I had seen that around, and I honestly, the first time I heard it, I thought it described a far right genetic determinism type of politics.
Right.
Like the HBD argument, but it's not. So to clarify, that's what biopolitics refers to. State power to control bodies. Basically. In this case, not black or brown bodies, just bodies. Yeah. Okay.
Right. And so, so Agamben's, like Agamben wrote a lot about this, that, there was kind of this realm of the human as the sort of biological being was not, he argues was for like most of history sort of not the concern of politics. Yeah. Like that sort of politics and public life was a place where that was kind of bracketed and put off to the side for the most part, except in like extreme emergencies like the plague, right? And so their argument is that, part of what happens with politics in the modern era is that, the state comes to exercise more and more power over bodies and over biology, right? And so, in some ways, like, COVID is a really good instance of it. Like, it's a really good place to look at this in action, right, and see how, in some ways in the U.S., the sort of libertarian inclinations, although that was heavily compromised in many ways, like by the Bush administration and the war on terror, right? That there was sort of this weird thing where like the sort of anti-statist worldview was kept intact, but there was a massive expansion of state power and
that would fall under. I mean, a lot of conservatives told themselves that would fall under the perfect part of government. The night watchman state is, so unless you're like an anarcho-capitalist, you can finagle a reason to support war on terror stuff in a way that you couldn't having some federal mandate on the use of certain flashing lights on your bike down to the local level, so for safety reasons or something, right? Anyway, even though they both are actually in a great, to a large degree, deal with security, and keeping people safe from harm. Yeah, there's. I had mentioned that in the 2000s there was a website. Well, it's still around, I believe, called LouRockwell.com, and it's sort of like the Austrian economics far right. And they had developed, clearly they're critical of a lot of government and nanny state and all of that, but they had developed a relationship with this journal called Telos, which is based in New York City. I went to one of their functions once in 2009 or so, and that journal had been founded by a Marxist scholar, Italian Marxist scholar named Paul Picone, and so we had this strange kind of natural rights libertarianism, breaking bread with negative dialectics Marxism, and and this guy Paul Picone had drawn a lot on Horkheimer and people like that, and I can't pretend to really understand a lot of what he's getting into there, but the fact is it culminated for Paul Picone in a critique of the managerial class,
Right.
You hear the term PMC thrown around a lot now, but he was talking about sort of, he was himself an academic, but somewhat of a rogue academic, and he was always calling out, his fellow academics as clearly being self-interested actors in political economy, and this made him somewhat endearing to people on the right who also, don't have much love for higher education and some kind of permanent state or permanent civil servant sort of strata they've always been at odds with, and so you get this kind of interesting overlap there.
Well, so the thing that makes me think of is this guy James Burnham, who was he was one of the founders of National Review, so like kind of an important figure of the kind of William Buckley crowd.
Fusionist.
What's that?
Fusionist. What does he represent that, or is that Frank Meyer? Did James Burnham also share that kind of?
I mean, yeah, he was part of that scene, definitely. But what's interesting about him was that he was, prior to that, I mean, and this isn't that atypical in the 20th century America, but he was prior to that like a Trotskyist. And I mean, he was not only a Trotskyist, he was like the Trotskyist because he was Trotsky's personal secretary for a while and like kind of his main point man in the U.S. So the biggest thing is like, I mean, so the way these connect is kind of going back to what you were just saying, which is this, Trotsky's critique of like Stalinist of Stalin's Soviet Union was that it, instead of abolishing the bourgeoisie and devolving power to the workers or whatever, it created this new kind of state bourgeoisie, essentially, right? This kind of state ruling class, this sort of bureaucratic management class, the sort of apparatchiks or whatever, right? Who was empowered by the party to control and suppress the workers. So that's kind of Trotsky's idea of like how the Russian Revolution was betrayed, right? So you can actually see how this. I mean, so he was he was making this argument about the rise of this new class, right, in the Soviet Union under Stalin, that constituted kind of a new ruling class, basically. And then Burnham sort of eventually takes that and he applies it to like the New Deal sort of bureaucratic state, the expansion of sort of this new like professionalized intelligentsia that was sort of empowered to govern people. So I mean, there really is this like deep, the sort of critique of like the PMC or whatever we want to call it. It does kind of come out of this Trotskyist criticism of the bureaucratic communist state, and then is like reapplied to, in Burnham's case, the U.S., but you see similar critiques in Europe, right, of the kind of new managerial, like sort of state managerial class that comes out of this kind.
It makes you wonder. It makes you wonder why you haven't seen kind of more left-right alliance on that kind of thing, and I think because it gets tripped up constantly by different object level criticisms, and by that I'll mean like so if you're on the right, you might use you might think there's no particular issue with you using like a real life black woman who works for the Center for Disease Control or whatever, saying something and using that as a critique of what you think is what you call a deep state or the permanent civil state. But if you're on the left, you'll see that sticks out to you as a concern. Like, why are you, basically bringing back 20th century racial stereotypes or something to get at this larger kind of high level, more dry political economic question where we might actually have some overlap. And then surely, the left does the same thing in a way that triggers the right. So it'll, the actual imagery you use in a specific example of kind of a bigger issue you want to get at is what ends up impeding some acknowledgement that we actually have very similar criticisms, and in fact, it calls into question having very similar criticisms at all, because if it gets abstract enough, you've basically taken out you've removed of any kind of cultural signifiers that people care about, But
right. But I mean, I guess one thing I think is interesting is, overall, to be very crude, it seems like the left in the U.S. at least often has a blind spot as to like the state, right? That it's sort of it doesn't quite know how to think about the state because it sees that as a bulwark against capital in some sense, right? Whereas the right is kind of the opposite, right? It has a blind spot to the way that like capital might work against the things it claims to value because it sees it as a bulwark against the state. But the problem is that, in reality, these two things are not, they're not really opposed, right? They're deeply the state and capital are like deeply enmeshed with each other in all sorts of ways. So you can't really critique one without critiquing the other. And yet that's what, roughly speaking, people tend to do. But I do think there's like maybe a sort of, I don't know, there may be sort of changes in that area that are finally happening in terms of how people think about this stuff, but I'm not totally sure because I think it's easier for us to fall back into what the sort of standard dividing lines have been.
You know what gets a little frustrating is the fact that let's say you have a left wing and a right wing person discussing the merits of criticism of the state or of the market, right? So both of them will almost always readily admit, oh, that's a problem too. You want to talk about the market, like, hey, I don't think everything capitalism does is great, and I have problems with that too. But I just think this is a bigger problem. So they don't really appear to be a real fundamental value clash. It tends to be, well, I put more weight on this than that. And I guess you could try to tease out how true that is by looking at the fact that they've, if they've ever complained about that thing or not. Like you say, you have problems with capitalism in the market, but I'm looking through your Twitter feed and I don't see much of that, right? But see, what people get into a dispute, they're hardly ever doing that kind of research, and so you're basically summing someone up by the average of the aggregate of the people on their side.
Yeah, I don't know. I also think like, in some way, seeing how, one notable thing recently has just been the clear kind of alignment of the corporate world with like progressive, at least certain kinds of progressive causes. And then on the other hand, you have that on one hand, and then you have for various kind of complicated structural reasons, the Republicans kind of being advantaged in their control of the electoral system, at least for the immediate future.
Yeah.
And so what that means, what's kind of bizarre about that is that, the left is in theory sort of the ones that are hostile to capital in some sense, but now they actually have greater power to kind of achieve their goals through this kind of privatized system of
that
redistribution, whereas
I never saw coming, and I don't see any evidence that the left itself really saw it coming, right? So like, in 2008, if you had put it out there, what we're seeing now, as far as, let's say you had imagine a left winger in 2008 saying, we need to utilize the power of the Fortune 500, not small businesses, but like the Amazons and the Apples and the Facebook, those things were all there in 2008. Yeah. Let's leverage this massive institutional corporate power to start winning culturally, to make and this will have, maybe not at the national level, but certainly this will all help with local politics. It will help make San Francisco even more solidly progressive, and make Brooklyn and New York City more solidly progressive. They would have thought that the idea was offensive. Like, not only do I not think we should do that, but there can't be any overlap with progressive justice in corporate power. I don't. Yeah. So the right would not have predicted the left would do that, and the left would have been very critical of the idea of even doing that. It just sort of happened anyway. It happened, I'd say, organically, but you see a Lyft email talking about BLM, and that doesn't seem very organic. But I still think in a way it kind of happened inadvertently or organically, like almost in an evolutionary sense, where no one of them thinks that's what they're doing, but just their collective behavior has rendered this possible. The blue check marks, so the so-called influentials, all contributing to it, one piece at a time, right?
Yeah. So what's weird is that each side kind of is somehow in control of the wrong thing, or like is sort of it's like the thing that they control is like actually the thing that they're ostensibly more skeptical of. So,
right. I mean, Republicans are in control of these state legislatures. I mean, there are progressives living in the Dakotas, you know, and they're like, look what I have to live under, right? And you know, a right-wing fellow in I say fellow like they're a member of a think tank, a right-wing person in like the Bay Area or something is going, look, I see total cultural dominance and political dominance by the left, you know. So, well, this is kind of getting away from your point, but they're because of where they're situated, they're seeing different things, you know. But yeah, that is funny that so you have progressives with corporate power who don't really want to acknowledge it because it's sort of unfashionable and awkward. And on the right, you see that as well. You know, they are critical of government, and yet they're utilizing it. Although I do think I see more of an acceptance of utilizing state power on the right, at least in the Trump era, which even if they haven't completely deviated from Reaganism, and it's more like that than people were thought it would be, and some people in some cases hoping it would be in 2016. The introduction of that is definitely present, you know.
Right.
The introduction of a conservatism that is more okay with state power. I'm trying to think of like even like highly prominent so-called, you know, blue checkmark progressives who are just celebrating the use of corporate power and saying this is something we should definitely do. We should keep doing it. It's a good thing. Let's stop criticizing some kind of FANG company monopoly power because this is clearly working in our favor. It just seemed very uncouth to do that. I don't really think I've seen that so explicitly.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's in a way one of the really notable developments of this year. Just how fully consolidated that seems to be. I mean, the first time I started thinking about it was like around Pride. I remember like years ago starting to see the posters for the big or no, not Pride, the big AIDS walk in New York. That was the place where I started seeing it. So
that goes pretty far back. Not just the actual AIDS walk, but like the corporate sponsorship is more recent than AIDS walks themselves. But yeah,
I know the AIDS walk. I mean, I remember going to it, or really like when I was in high school. You know, and it was like a pretty, I don't know, like, I mean, it was big, but it was like I think a more spontaneous and organic kind of thing.
Yeah.
But now it's like when the AIDS walk is coming up, you know, it's like you see these posters which are full of all this sort of social justice. So all the big pharma companies, and then, you know, which, okay, I guess it makes sense that they would be. And then, you know, all the sort of other major corporate sponsors. And I mean, that was the first time when I first started seeing this kind of constellation as interesting. I mean, obviously, like I thought of Pride as well, because I think that's like kind of been a critique, you know, within the LGBTQ community, where it's like the corporate sponsorship has just like turned it into this kind of farce. Like a lot of
in California, you know, there's been criticism of Wells Fargo Bank, you know, as a corporate sponsorship of Pride for quite a while.
Yeah. So, but that was kind of the first place where I think I saw this like corporate social justice constellation like really clearly embodied was in this AIDS walk poster and that was probably 6 or 7 years ago that I first noticed that, and I was like, okay, this is. So I mean that, you know, that was kind of one of the harbingers, you know, and like the corporatization of Pride was like a parallel thing, but.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because people had been speculating that, well, on the right, you saw the argument that, you know, corporate colonization of LGBT rights kind of makes sense because, you know, gay people are well behaved and white, or they think of it as white. They think of it as somehow bougie or something, you know, but they're not going to latch on to race politics in the same way because that, you know, black people scare them. But anyway, that's not true, as we're seeing.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, I don't know. So they are willing to get into, you know, Malcolm X holding an AK-47 and looking out his window territory,
right.
even if it's not specifically that image. They've shown themselves willing to go there as well. Right. And so I don't know what it's going to mean going forward. We'll, you know, anyway, 2020s will be interesting.
Yeah. But yeah, I think right that it's interesting. There's no like nobody sort of announced this as like a strategy. I don't think and that's if you compare it to sort of I don't know, like the right the right was all like during the Obama years was all obsessed with like Saul Alinsky and that sort of organizing strategy that he proposed. Yeah. I don't think there's a like Saul Alinsky who sort of planned out this sort of progressive takeover of the corporations.
Right.
So
I'm
I could be wrong.
A lot of people, well, on Twitter especially, because it's so presentist. It's like there's what's hot today, and people are just talking about that. But I'm interested in intellectual history, but of Twitter. Just going back as far as it's been around, like I guess about 15 years, maybe a little less.
Right.
Doesn't it feel like Twitter has only been around for 5 years? I don't know. 15 years. I don't know why. But intellectual history of Twitter, like just kind of the lay progressive or the lay conservative prognosticating on Twitter over the years. I'd like to see like a good audit of that, because a lot of this stuff I don't think people saw it coming, and people who feign as if they did see it coming, I think they're probably wrong, but I'd like to see it proved, Anyway, all right, so we've been talking for an hour. I guess I'll let you go.
Yeah.
It's like hot in New York, right? Or like, what is it like over there this time of year?
Yeah, it's hot.
Yeah.
It's hot.
Yeah. We had a heat wave here recently, and then we had lightning and thunder, which not only doesn't really happen this time of year in California, pretty much never happens.
Right.
And so, it's been weirdly hot here, although today's not so bad. Well, anyway, I put small talk at the end.
Yeah, well, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, nice talking to you.
Happy to talk again anytime.